And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers are warned that the following story does contain images of deceased persons. George Newhouse, welcome to the show. As I understand it, George, you will be marching in Sydney's protests today, despite it being illegal.
Well, I'll be going along with other lawyers from the Aboriginal Legal Service to support the families who were hoping to speak today. Now, the situation is very confused. The Supreme Court decision really puts people in a legal limbo. It didn't actually prohibit the event today, but it didn't approve it either. So the police are going to have to rely on the COVID-19 health laws and the Summary Offences Act to manage this event. They've effectively taken away the leadership of the event organisers, and the police are going to have to manage the potentially thousands of people who appear in Sydney this afternoon.
What does that look like on the ground? What does that mean when you say that they will have to use the emergency laws that are currently in place because of the pandemic?
Well, it's perfectly legal for up to 10 people to be together outdoors as long as they socially distance. So people could attend this rally and march in a group of 10 as long as they are socially distanced. But the police have made a rod for their back because the original plan was to close roads and allow enough space for people to march on the road and distance themselves. What this means now is that people have to comply with the Summary Offences Act, which means they have to walk on the footpath and they're going to have to distance themselves on the footpath. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be a legal mess, and it may well be very difficult for the police to manage.
George, why is it important for you to take part in this protest today?
Well, I am supporting, in particular today, Leetona Dungay, the mother of David Dungay, who died crying out like George Floyd, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." The officers, like George Floyd, also said, if you can talk, you can breathe. Both cases are very similar. And Leetona believes that she has not received justice. There's been no accountability for what happened to her son. Not even Safe Work New South Wales are prepared to lift a finger to investigate what happened to her son. And she wants to show her solidarity with the family of George Floyd. And I'm there with the lawyers from ALS and other organisations to support those families who want to have their voices heard.
George, you work in the justice system. We've had the last Royal Commission into deaths in custody in 1991. Since then, more than 400 Indigenous deaths in custody have occurred, not one single conviction. What is going on here? What's happening?
Well, Aboriginal people do not understand after 230 years of colonial history, why they are still dying in such numbers in custody, in police custody and in prisons and youth detention centres. And they want that to stop, and they believe that George Floyd's case is one that has brought out a well of sympathy from the general community in their plight. They're asking simply that the Royal Commission into Aboriginal death in custody's recommendations be implemented, and they were to divert people away from the criminal justice system into social welfare, address the socio-economic issues that beset Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and recognise sovereignty. And that resonates today with the Uluru Statement, where you hear cries for voice, treaty and truth.
We've seen protests after protests every time there is an Indigenous death in custody. We've seen that here. We've seen it in the United States. However, there seems to be more attention that's paid in the United States. Why isn't there more attention paid to Indigenous deaths in custody here in Australia?
Look, a lot of people ask that question. I think the biggest difference is that Aboriginal people are 2% of the Australian population, and I've seen figures in the United States of African Americans being around 17%. So there's much more visibility of African American populations in the United States. Aboriginal people seem to be kept out of sight and out of mind. And I think also Australians, who are on the whole exceptionally fair-minded people, find it very difficult to accept that our prosperity is based on the theft of another people's land and the virtual destruction or the attempted destruction of their culture. So there's a little blind spot in the Australian psyche, but also I think the better comparison is Native Americans, who aren't as visible as the African American community.
Some of the discussions that have come up after George Floyd's death and during these protests also is the issue of white privilege and white guilt. The issue of what can non-Black or non-African American or non-Indigenous people do to try to help raise the standards and the lives of Indigenous peoples, particularly here in Australia?
Well, I think the Uluru Statement and the recommendations of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody are the markers that we should look at. Aboriginal people are asking to have a voice, for them to be heard, to be treated as equals, to have the truth of the history of our nation and of their treatment in custody revealed and accepted, and then they want a treaty to actually sit down as equals with the Australian people, with non-Indigenous Australian people, and come to an accord. I don't think that's unreasonable to ask. And if you follow those guidelines, I think you'll see Indigenous lives improve around our nation.
George Newhouse, thank you for joining us this morning. Good luck with the protests.
Thank you.
Let's turn overseas now.